What would you do if someone you loved, someone who called you family, who sat at your table, who held your grandchildren, looked you in the eye and tried to erase you, not with violence, with paperwork, with lawyers and lies and the kind of betrayal that's technically legal until you prove it isn't? Most people, when I tell them what my son-in-law attempted, ask me how I stayed calm. That's the wrong question. The right question is, how did I know 6 months before he made his move that he was going to make it? And more importantly, why did I let him? Because here's the truth. They don't teach you in business school or family therapy. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone hell-bent on destroying themselves is to hand them the rope, step back, and let consequences be the teacher you could never be. I'm William, and what I'm about to share with you isn't a revenge story. It's something more complicated and more useful than that. It's about how to love people without being naive, how to prepare for betrayal without becoming bitter, how to win without cruelty, and how to teach the hardest lessons without saying a single word. Because here's what nobody tells you. You've been lied to about what strength looks like. You've been taught that family loyalty means tolerating betrayal, that setting boundaries makes you cruel, that if you're prepared for the worst in people you love, you're cynical or paranoid. And that lie, that specific lie, costs people everything. Their homes, their peace, their relationships, their sense of reality. This video is going to dismantle that lie piece by piece, but I'm going to show you how to build a life so structurally sound that other people's chaos can't destabilize you. Not because you're cold or defended, but because you understand something most people never learn. Preparation isn't the opposite of love. Preparation is love made practical. It's what you do when you care enough about the people you love to protect them from their own worst impulses and to protect yourself so you can still be there when they're ready to come back. What you're going to get in the next hour isn't just my story. It's a framework, a way of thinking about trust, power, family, and boundaries that most people never encounter because we're so busy being told to either build walls or be doormats. I'm showing you the third option, the one where you stay soft but never stupid, where you stay open but never vulnerable to destruction, where you can be generous without being a mark. And I'm going to do it by walking you through exactly what happened that morning at 5 a.m. when my security system activated, when my son-in-law showed up with workers and forged documents claiming he owned my countryside house, and when I took a sip of coffee and smiled because of what I'd done the night before. But more than that, I'm going to show you the 6 months that led up to that morning, the small decisions, the quiet preparations, the emotional discipline it took to see someone I loved planning to hurt me and to respond not with rage but with architecture, because that's the real skill. Anyone can react. The question is, can you respond? Can you see betrayal coming and prepare for it without becoming the kind of person who sees betrayal everywhere? Can you protect yourself without closing your heart? Can you be strong enough to be kind even when kindness looks like consequences? That's what we're here to figure out. So stay with me. This gets deep and it gets real. And by the end, you're going to see your relationships differently. You're going to see power differently, and you might just see yourself differently too. Let's begin. It was November when I first noticed something was off. Not wrong exactly, just off, like when you walk into a room and the furniture's been moved 3 inches and you can't quite name what's different, but your body knows. We were having Sunday dinner at my countryside house, the one at the center of this whole story. My daughter Sarah, her husband Marcus, their 2 kids, and me. This was our tradition. Every other Sunday, I'd cook something too elaborate, the grandkids would run through the garden, and we'd pretend we were the kind of family that did this effortlessly. Marcus was quieter than usual, not sulking quiet, observing quiet. I watched him watch the house, his eyes lingering on the crown moulding I'd restored myself, the way he traced his finger along the mahogany banister. At one point, he asked me, casual as anything, what I paid in property taxes on the place. Now, that's not a crazy question. We talked about money sometimes. I'd built my wealth in real estate and property development, so these conversations weren't unusual. But there was something in the way he asked, something in the tone, like he was collecting data, not making conversation. I answered honestly, told him the annual tax burden, mentioned that it had gone up since the area got rezoned. He nodded, filed it away in his mind. Then he asked about the deed. Was it in a trust? In my name personally? What would happen to it if something happened to me? My daughter was in the kitchen. The kids were playing. It was just him and me on the back porch. And I remember looking at him, really looking, and seeing something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't malice, it was hunger. The specific kind of hunger that comes from living adjacent to something you want but can't have. I didn't react. I answered his questions. I even offered more information than he asked for, because I wanted to see how far his curiosity would go. And here's what I learned that afternoon. Marcus wasn't just interested in my estate planning. He was studying it, the way you study something you're planning to interact with. That night after they left, I sat in my study and asked myself the hardest question. Was I being paranoid or was I being perceptive? Because here's the trap, right? If you're suspicious of everyone, you poison every relationship and you live in hell. But if you ignore clear signals because you don't want to be suspicious, you get destroyed by people you should have seen coming. So how do you know? How do you tell the difference between intuition and paranoia? I've spent 40 years learning to answer that question, and here's what I've figured out. Your body knows before your mind does. That feeling in your gut, that subtle wrongness you can't quite name, that's pattern recognition happening faster than conscious thought. Your subconscious has processed 1,000 microsignals and reached a conclusion, and it's trying to warn you, but your conscious mind fights it because your conscious mind is invested in the story you've been telling yourself. The story where Marcus loves my daughter, where he's a good father, where he's grateful for the help I've given him over the years. Your conscious mind doesn't want to rewrite that story because rewriting it hurts. So that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to ignore my gut, but I also wasn't going to confront him based on a feeling. Instead, I was going to pay attention, to document, to quietly verify whether my instinct was right. And here's the thing. I hoped I was wrong. I genuinely hoped that in 6 months I'd look back and laugh at myself for being a paranoid old man. But hope and preparation aren't opposites. You can hope for the best while preparing for the worst. In fact, that's the only sane way to live. So I started watching, not obsessively, not angrily, just carefully. 2 weeks later, Marcus offered to help me reorganize my filing cabinets, said he noticed they were getting cluttered, wanted to help me digitize some documents. It was a kind offer. Helpful, exactly the sort of thing a good son-in-law does. I said yes, and then I watched what he paid attention to. He wasn't interested in the tax records or the business files. He went straight for the property documents, pulled out the deed to the countryside house, photographed it with his phone, said he was just keeping a digital copy in case I ever needed it, and couldn't find the original. He lingered on the title page, asked me again about the trust situation, mentioned that a friend of his had told him about adverse possession laws and wasn't it crazy what could happen with property rights if you weren't careful. My heart was breaking even as my mind was taking notes. Because I loved this man, not like a son, I won't be dishonest about that, but I loved him as the person my daughter chose, the father of my grandchildren. I'd helped him get his first real job. I'd loaned him money when his business idea failed. I'd been there, and now I was watching him prepare to do something I couldn't quite believe yet. After he left that day, I checked my home security footage. I have cameras throughout the house, not hidden, just standard security, and I watched him when he thought I'd gone to the bathroom. Opened my desk drawer and photographed documents he had no reason to be looking at. Estate papers, the original property survey, insurance documents. That was the moment I knew, and the feeling that washed over me wasn't anger, it was grief. Because I realized I was going to have to protect myself from someone my daughter loved. I was going to have to prepare for a betrayal that would hurt her when it came to light, and there was nothing I could do to stop it without causing the very pain I was trying to prevent. So I did the only thing that made sense. I scheduled an appointment with my attorney. I didn't tell her I suspected Marcus of planning fraud. I just told her I wanted to update my estate planning, make sure everything was airtight. She thought I was being prudent, which I was, but I was being specifically prudent. I was closing loopholes I hadn't even known existed until I started imagining how someone might try to exploit them. Over the next 3 months, I did several things. First, I transferred the countryside house into an irrevocable family trust with Sarah as the primary beneficiary and myself as the lifetime trustee. This meant the property was no longer in my personal name. Any attempt to forge ownership documents would be attempting to steal from a trust entity, which is a different legal situation entirely and much harder to execute. Second, I upgraded my security system, added more cameras, made sure every entry point was documented, but more importantly, I made sure the system logged network activity, because Marcus had been using my Wi-Fi network when he visited, and I wanted to know what he was searching for. That's how I found out in January that he'd been researching property fraud, how to contest a deed, how adverse possession works, what constitutes abandonment of property. He'd even looked up the specific legal process for claiming ownership of rural properties when the owner is elderly and potentially mentally incompetent. That last one hurt, because the implication was clear. He wasn't just planning to steal the house, he was planning to claim I wasn't mentally fit to manage it. I printed everything, dated it, stored it with my attorney, still didn't confront him, still didn't tell Sarah, because what was I going to say? Your husband is researching how to steal my house? Based on what? Google searches? She'd think I was paranoid, or worse, she'd confront him and he'd lie, and then I'd be the one creating family division. So I waited, and I prepared. And I loved them all the same as I always had, even as I was building a legal fortress they didn't know existed. In March, Marcus asked me about my health, whether I'd been feeling forgetful, whether I'd considered what would happen if I couldn't manage my affairs anymore. Had I thought about a power of attorney? He'd be happy to help with that paperwork if I needed it. I told him I appreciated his concern, but I was sharp as ever. He smiled, nodded, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was establishing a narrative, planting seeds. If this ever went to court, he'd be able to say, I was worried about William's mental state as early as March. He was showing signs. And that's when I knew it wasn't just about the house. It was about control, about rewriting reality. And people who are willing to rewrite reality are dangerous because they don't just lie to you. They lie to themselves first. They create a story where they're the hero and you're the obstacle. And once they believe that story, they're capable of almost anything. April was quiet. He didn't visit as much. When he did, he was distant. Police, but separate. Like he was already starting to see me as the adversary he'd decided I was. In May, I found out he'd been to the county records office. The clerk there was someone I'd known for 20 years, and she mentioned casually that my son-in-law had been asking questions about the property, wanted to know how to check for liens, how to verify ownership, whether there was a process for correcting errors on deeds. I thanked her for the information, went home, updated my documentation. By this point, I had everything. Browser history, security footage, witness statements, legal opinions from my attorney about what his actions suggested, but I still didn't act because I was waiting for one specific thing. I was waiting to see if he'd back down, if at some point his conscience or his fear or his love for Sarah would stop him. I was giving him every opportunity to choose differently. He didn't take it. The night before that 5 a.m. phone call, I got a tip from a private investigator I'd quietly hired. Marcus had contacted a moving company, scheduled them for the following morning, early, before dawn. He'd also been in contact with a document forger, someone who specialized in creating fake property deeds and legal papers. That was it, the final piece. He wasn't just thinking about it anymore, he was doing it. So that night, at 11 p.m., I drove to my attorney's office. She'd agreed to meet me after hours because she understood this was urgent. And I filed the final paperwork. The trust documents went on record. The property transfer was official and time-stamped. By midnight, I no longer personally owned the countryside house. It belonged to an irrevocable trust that I managed but could not be defrauded from in the way Marcus was planning. Then I went home, made a pot of coffee, and waited, because I knew what was coming. I'd prepared for every version of it, but I still didn't know exactly how it would feel when it actually happened. The call came at 5:07 a.m. My security guard, Danny, young guy, worked nights, good kid, his voice was shaking. "Mr. William, we have a situation. Your son-in-law is at the gate with a moving truck and about 6 workers. He's saying he owns the property now, he has documents. He's demanding that I let him in and that you need to leave immediately." I could hear Marcus in the background, his voice loud and authoritative, telling Danny that he had legal ownership and that if Danny didn't open the gate, he'd be liable for preventing a property owner from accessing his own land. I took a sip of my coffee. It was Ethiopian, single origin, brewed carefully. I'd bought it because I knew this moment was coming and I wanted to remember it with something good. I know that sounds strange, but details matter when your world is shifting. "Danny," I said, calm as I could manage, "let him in. Don't argue, don't resist. Just open the gate and call the sheriff's office to send a deputy. Tell them it's not an emergency, but I've requested law enforcement presence for a property dispute." "But sir," he's saying. "I know what he's saying. Let him in. I want him to walk all the way in." I hung up, stood up, got dressed. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, because rushed means scared, and I wasn't scared. I was heartbroken, but I wasn't scared. I could hear the trucks pulling up the gravel drive, voices, the beep of a vehicle backing up, the sound of men being given instructions. I walked to the window of my study, 2nd floor, overlooking the front of the house. And I watched. Marcus was directing the workers like he owned the place, which in his mind he did. He had a clipboard. He had documents in a folder. He was pointing at furniture through the windows, telling them what to load first, and I just watched him. Studied his face. He didn't look guilty. He looked justified, righteous even, like he'd finally claimed something that should have been his all along. That's what delusion looks like. It doesn't look crazy. It looks certain. I went downstairs, unlocked the front door, stepped out onto the porch. The workers stopped, looked confused. Marcus turned around. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I saw him see me, really see me, not as the obstacle he'd built up in his mind, but as me, the man who'd welcomed him into the family, who'd helped him, who'd trusted him. For just a second, I saw doubt flicker across his face. But then he squared his shoulders and walked toward me. "William," he said, formal, distant. "I know this is difficult, but I have legal ownership of this property now. I'm going to need you to gather your personal belongings and vacate. You can take your time, but as of this morning, this house is mine." He handed me the folder. I didn't open it. I knew what was in there. Forged deed, fake documentation claiming the property had been transferred to him, maybe some fabricated paperwork suggesting I'd been mentally incompetent. All very official looking, all completely fraudulent. "Did you do this yourself?" I asked quietly. "Or did you have help?" He blinked. Hadn't expected that question. "That's not relevant. The documents are legal." "They're not," I said, "but I'm curious about the process. Did you research this on your own, or did someone teach you how?" His face changed. Wariness crept in. "How would you—" "I have Wi-Fi logs, Marcus, every search you ran on my network for the past 6 months. Or I have security footage of you photographing my documents. I have a statement from the county clerk about your visits. I have testimony from the document forger you hired. Yes, he's already cooperating with my attorney. And most importantly, I have the property transfer I filed last night at midnight, putting this house into an irrevocable trust that you have no claim to." The color drained from his face. "The documents you're holding," I continued, "are forgeries attempting to claim ownership of a property I don't personally own anymore, which means you're not just committing fraud, you're committing fraud against a trust entity which is federal." Behind him, the workers were starting to back away. They'd heard enough to know they'd been hired for a crime. Marcus stood there, frozen, the folder shaking slightly in his hands. And I saw it happen. The exact moment someone's reality collapses. When the story they've been telling themselves, the one where they're clever and justified and about to win, shatters completely. "Why?" he finally said, and his voice was small. "Why did you let me get this far, if you knew?" And that's the question, isn't it? That's the one that matters. "Because," I said, and I meant this, "I loved you enough to hope you'd stop. Every step of the way, I gave you the chance to choose differently. And I loved my daughter enough to make sure that when you didn't, it wouldn't destroy her life." A car pulled up. Sarah's car. I'd called her 20 minutes earlier as soon as Danny had called me. Told her to come to the house, told her she needed to see something. She got out, saw the moving trucks, saw Marcus holding the folder, saw my face. And she knew. You always know. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was already breaking. "What did you do?" I handed her a different folder, the one I'd prepared, everything documented, the timeline, the evidence, the legal analysis. And at the end, a letter I'd written to her explaining that I wasn't pressing criminal charges on one condition. Marcus agreed to complete restitution of trust, which meant full honesty, family therapy, and genuine accountability. She read it. Tears streaming down her face. And then she looked at her husband like she was seeing a stranger. "I did this for us," Marcus said desperately. "This house should be ours. You're his daughter. It's not fair that—" "Stop," she said. "Just stop." The sheriff's deputy arrived. I gave him the documentation, explained the situation calmly, legally. The workers were dismissed. They hadn't known it was fraud, so no charges for them. Marcus was given the choice: accept my terms or face prosecution. He took my terms. What else could he do? But here's the thing, here's the part that nobody tells you about moments like this. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because I'd won, yes, I'd protected myself and my daughter, and even, in a strange way, protected Marcus from the worst version of himself. But the cost was the death of a relationship, the death of the family we'd pretended to be. And standing there that morning, watching my daughter cry and my son-in-law realize what he'd destroyed, I understood something I'd known intellectually, but never felt this deeply. Boundaries aren't walls. They're not about keeping people out. They're about showing people exactly where safety ends and consequence begins. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone run full speed into those consequences, because it's the only way they'll learn that the boundaries were there to protect them, not punish them. Over the next few months, Marcus and Sarah went to therapy. He had to face what he'd done, why he'd done it, and who he'd become in the process. It was brutal. There were moments I thought their marriage wouldn't survive. But slowly, something unexpected happened. When Marcus finally stopped lying, to me, to Sarah, to himself, when he finally faced the truth about his own insecurity and resentment and the story he'd built, where I was the villain keeping him small, he started to become someone real, not someone I trusted immediately. Trust is rebuilt slowly, with patterns, not words, but someone who was at least trying to be honest. And Sarah had to face her own truth too, that she'd seen signs and ignored them because seeing them would have forced her to choose between her father and her husband, that she'd been complicit in a different way by creating an environment where Marcus felt he couldn't talk about feeling inadequate or erased. The whole thing was messy and painful and human in the way that real transformation always is. A year later, we had Sunday dinner again. Different this time, quieter, more honest. Marcus didn't ask about my estate planning. We talked about his new job, about the kids, about normal things. And there was a moment where he looked at me and said, "Thank you for not destroying me when you could have." I didn't say "you're welcome," because that felt wrong. Instead, I said, "I destroyed the lie. The person who survived that is who you actually are. I didn't want to destroy him." Now, I'm telling you this story not because I think you have a son-in-law planning to steal your house. Most of you don't. But because the principles underneath this situation apply to almost every relationship where power, trust, and love intersect. So let me break down what I actually learned, not the surface lessons about estate planning or security systems. Those are just tools. I'm talking about the deeper architecture of how to navigate betrayal without becoming bitter, how to protect yourself without closing your heart, and how to love people while still maintaining the boundaries that keep everyone safe. The first thing I learned is this: preparation is not the opposite of trust. It's actually a form of love. We've been taught this false binary where either you trust someone completely, which means being totally vulnerable to them, or you don't trust them at all, which means building walls. But that's not how adults love each other. That's how children think about relationships. Real trust, mature trust, is saying, "I believe in your good intentions, and I'm also going to create structures that protect both of us from your human weaknesses." Think about it this way. When you put a seatbelt on your child, are you saying you don't trust yourself to drive safely? No. You're saying you love them enough to prepare for the possibility of an accident, even while you're doing everything you can to prevent one. That's what I was doing with Marcus. The trust documents, the security systems, the documentation, none of that was about not trusting him. It was about loving my daughter enough to make sure that if he made the worst possible choice, it wouldn't destroy her inheritance. It was about loving him enough to create a situation where his betrayal would be caught before it became irreversible. Because here's what most people don't understand. When you fail to prepare for someone's potential betrayal, you're not being trusting, you're being lazy, you're outsourcing your safety to their good behavior, and that's not fair to either of you. If someone is trustworthy, they won't be threatened by reasonable safeguards. If they are threatened by them, that's information. When I told Marcus I was updating my estate planning, a trustworthy response would have been, "That's smart, Dad. Let me know if you need help with anything." A suspicious response is told, "Why? Don't you trust me?" See the difference? Trustworthy people welcome structure because structure protects everyone. Untrustworthy people resist it because it limits their options. So the first practice is this: stop feeling guilty for preparing. Stop apologizing for protecting yourself. You can love someone deeply and still have passwords. on your accounts. You can trust your business partner and still require dual signatures on major transactions. You can believe in your spouse's fidelity and still keep your finances partially separate. These aren't contradictions. They're the basics of adult relationship management. And here's the emotional benefit. When you've prepared properly, you don't have to be paranoid. Paranoia is what happens when you're vulnerable but pretending you're not. When you're actually protected, you can relax, you can be generous, you can be open, because you know that even if the worst happens, you'll survive it. I was kinder to Marcus after I'd set up the trust than I was before, because I wasn't walking around with that low-level anxiety of, what if he tries something? I knew what would happen if he tried something. So I could just love him without that edge of fear. That's the paradox. Structure creates freedom. Boundaries create intimacy. Preparation creates peace. The second thing I learned is that most betrayal doesn't come from evil, it comes from pain. Marcus didn't wake up one day and decide to become a criminal. He woke up every day feeling small, feeling like he was living in my shadow, and feeling like no matter what he achieved, he'd always be William's son-in-law instead of his own man. And I had contributed to that, not maliciously, but through thoughtlessness. Every time he had a problem, I solved it before he could try. Every time he started a project, I offered advice that, however well-intentioned, communicated you're doing it wrong. Every time we were together in public, people asked me questions and listened to my answers and treated him like an accessory. I was so busy being competent that I never created space for him to be competent with me. I was generous with money but stingy with respect, and that created a specific kind of suffering. People who feel chronically diminished will eventually do something to feel big again. Sometimes that's starting a business or running a marathon or having an affair. Sometimes it's trying to take something from the person who makes them feel small. It's not right. It's not justified. But it is understandable, and when you understand the pain underneath someone's betrayal, you don't have to excuse it, but you can stop taking it so personally. Because it's not really about you, it's about them trying to escape a feeling they don't have the tools to process differently. This doesn't mean you let them hurt you, it means you see them clearly while you protect yourself. The question I had to ask myself was, what role did I play in creating the conditions where betrayal felt like his only option? Not because I'm responsible for his choices, I'm not, but because if I want different outcomes in the future, I have to be honest about the dynamics I create. And what I realized was that I'd been so focused on being the provider, the successful one, the patriarch, that I'd never asked Marcus what he needed to feel like an equal. I'd assumed that my generosity would create gratitude, but generosity without respect creates resentment. So the second practice is this: when someone betrays you, ask yourself, what pain were they trying to escape? Not to excuse them, not to take blame that isn't yours, but to understand the full picture. Because if you can see their pain, you can make a different choice about how to respond. You can choose consequences that teach instead of just punish. You can choose boundaries that protect without dehumanizing. In Marcus's case, the consequence was full honesty and therapy, not prison, because prison would have just confirmed his story that I was the powerful one crushing him. Therapy gave him the chance to face his own pain and make different choices. That's sophisticated power. That's what it looks like to be strong enough to be kind. The third thing I learned is that you have to decide who you want to be when you're winning. That morning when Marcus stood in my driveway, I had total power. I had the law on my side. I had the evidence. I had the moral high ground. I could have humiliated him in front of the workers, called the police immediately, pressed every charge possible, made an example out of him. And part of me wanted to. The hurt part, the part that felt betrayed and disrespected and tired of being the bigger person. But I kept asking myself one question. What kind of man do I want to be when I have all the power and someone who hurt me is at my mercy? Because that's the real test of character. Anyone can be decent when they're losing. Anyone can be kind when they need something. But who are you when you're winning? When you could crush someone and face no consequences? That's when you find out what you're actually made of. I decided I wanted to be the kind of man who wins without cruelty, who protects himself without destroying others, who teaches hard lessons but leaves room for redemption, not because I'm a saint, I'm not, but because I've learned that how you treat people when you're winning shapes who you become. And I didn't want to become hard. I didn't want to become someone who uses power to wound. There's a quote I love. The true measure of a man is how he treats someone who can do him absolutely no good. I'd add to that, the true measure is also how you treat someone who's tried to do you harm when you have the power to harm them back. Mercy isn't weakness. Mercy is what you can afford when you're genuinely secure. If you can't afford mercy, you're not actually safe yet. You're still operating from fear. And decisions made from fear might feel like strength, but they're actually just protection masquerading as power. Real power is calm, it's measured, it doesn't need to prove anything because it knows itself. So the third practice is this: before you respond to a betrayal, ask yourself, who do I want to be in this moment? Not what do you want to do to them? Who do you want to be? Because that choice, that one choice, determines whether this betrayal makes you smaller or larger. Whether it closes your heart or clarifies your boundaries, whether it turns you into someone you're proud of or someone you have to justify. I chose to be someone who offered Marcus a path back. Not because he deserved it, but because my grandchildren deserved a father who'd learned from his mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. Because my daughter deserved a chance to rebuild her marriage if that's what she chose. And because I deserve to remain the kind of person who believes in second chances even when they're hard to give. That choice didn't cost me anything. I was already safe. The trust was filed. The evidence was documented. I could afford to be generous because my generosity didn't create vulnerability. And that's the key. Be as kind as you can afford to be, but make sure you can afford it first. Build your safety, then build your mercy. The fourth thing I learned is that systems are kinder than confrontations. When I first suspected Marcus was planning something, I could have confronted him, sat him down. I notice you've been asking a lot of questions about the property. What's going on? And what would have happened? He would have denied it. I would have had no proof, just suspicions. He would have gotten defensive. I would have looked paranoid. The tension would have infected every family gathering. Sarah would have been forced to choose sides, and he would have just gotten better at hiding his plans. Confrontation in that scenario would have created drama without creating resolution. Instead, I changed the system. I updated the trust structure. I documented everything. I created a situation where his fraud would either be impossible or self-revealing. And that's so much cleaner because systems don't argue. They don't get emotional. They just are. He couldn't get mad at a trust document. He couldn't manipulate legal facts. The system just showed the truth, and the truth did the work I would have exhausted myself trying to do through confrontation. This applies to so many situations. If you suspect your teenager is lying about their whereabouts, you can interrogate them every time they leave the house and create a relationship based on suspicion, or you can use location sharing on their phone and say, this isn't about trust, it's about safety. Everyone in the family shares their location. If you suspect a business partner is fudging numbers, you can accuse them and create a hostile work environment, or you can implement transparent accounting software where every transaction is visible to all partners in real time. If you suspect your spouse is hiding money, you can go through their phone and create World War III, or you can suggest, let's use a shared financial app where we can both see everything. It'll help us budget better. Honest people will welcome good systems. Dishonest people will resist them, and their reaction tells you everything you need to know without you having to become the accuser. The beauty of this approach is that you stay grounded. You're not spinning in paranoid fantasies. You're not having imaginary arguments in the shower. You're just improving structures, which is always reasonable. And if you're wrong about the suspicion, you've still improved your life. Better accounting is good whether or not someone's stealing. Location sharing is good whether or not your kid is lying. Trust structures are good whether or not someone's planning fraud. So the fourth practice is this: when you suspect betrayal, don't confront, architect. Build systems that make the truth inevitable. Let reality do the teaching. This isn't about being controlling or manipulative. It's about recognizing that most people, when given the opportunity to lie without consequences, will at least be tempted. Remove the opportunity, not as punishment, but as protection for everyone involved. Because here's what systems do. They remove temptation. And removing temptation is an act of love. You're not testing people. You're protecting them from a version of themselves they don't want to become. The fifth thing I learned is that consequences are sometimes the only teacher that works. For 6 months, I watched Marcus plan this fraud. And people have asked me, why didn't you just tell him you knew? Why didn't you warn him off? Because warnings don't work on people who've convinced themselves of their own story. Marcus had built an entire narrative where this was justified, where I was the obstacle, where taking the house was somehow fair compensation for feeling small. He'd told himself that story so many times it had become his reality. If I'd confronted him with that story still intact, he would have just modified his plan, gotten sneakier, waited longer. The story would have remained, and the story was the problem. The only thing that could shatter that story was consequences. He needed to run full speed into the reality that his narrative was false. That I wasn't the doddering old man he'd imagined. That fraud has costs. That betrayal doesn't lead to triumph. He needed to feel what it feels like when your entire reality collapses in a single moment, when the thing you thought was yours turns out to be a mirage, when the victory you'd already tasted turns to ash. That's not cruelty, that's education. And some lessons can only be learned through experience. There's a concept in parenting called natural consequences. If your child refuses to wear a coat, you don't fight them. You let them go outside and get cold. The cold teaches them faster than any lecture could. This is the adult version of that. Marcus refused to listen to reason, conscience, or love. So I let him experience the natural consequence of fraud, total failure, and exposure. And you know what? It worked. Not immediately. It took months of therapy and honesty and facing himself. But eventually, he became someone who understood why what he did was wrong in a way that no conversation could have taught him. Because consequences don't just punish, they clarify. They show you who you actually are versus who you thought you were. And that clarity, however painful, is the beginning of real change. So the fifth practice is this: sometimes the most loving thing you can do is nothing. Let the consequences teach what your words cannot. This doesn't mean being passive in the face of harm. It means being strategic about when to intervene and when to step back. If someone is harming themselves or others, you intervene. But if someone is simply choosing a hard path, despite your warnings, sometimes you have to let them walk it, because rescuing people from their own choices doesn't help them. It just delays their learning and makes you responsible for their growth. I could have stopped Marcus at any point, could have scared him off with a warning, but then he would have remained the person who thought fraud was viable if you just planned it better. By letting him execute his plan and fail completely, I gave him the chance to become someone different. That's a gift, even though it doesn't feel like one. Now, I want to talk about something nobody discusses: the loneliness of seeing clearly. When I first suspected what Marcus was planning, I couldn't talk about it. Couldn't tell Sarah because that would force her into an impossible position. Couldn't tell friends because it sounded paranoid. Couldn't even fully trust my own perceptions because the alternative, that I was wrong and damaging the relationship with suspicion, was so appealing. So I carried it alone, watched alone, prepared alone. And that isolation is one of the hidden costs of being the person who sees clearly and acts responsibly. Because most people don't want to see clearly. They want to hope. They want to trust blindly and believe that good intentions protect you from bad outcomes. And when you're the one saying, I love you and I'm also installing security cameras, you become the paranoid one, the cynical one, the one who's ruining the family dynamic with your suspicions. But the thing is, you're actually the one taking responsibility. You're the one mature enough to hold the complexity that someone can be both loved and dangerous, that good people can make terrible choices. That protection doesn't mean lack of love. And that's lonely, because you're operating a level of sophistication that most people either haven't reached yet or don't want to reach, because it requires giving up the comforting simplicity of black and white thinking. So if you're in that position, if you're the one who sees the problems everyone else is ignoring, if you're preparing for scenarios everyone else thinks you're crazy for considering, I want you to know you're not paranoid, you're not broken, you're not damaged by past betrayals, you're just awake. And being awake in a world that prefers sleep is isolating, but it's also powerful. Because when the thing you saw coming actually arrives, you're ready. And everyone who thought you were paranoid suddenly understands that you were just perceptive. That morning, when Marcus showed up, my daughter initially thought I'd overreacted by calling her. By the time she'd read the documentation, she understood I'd actually underreacted, that I'd been protecting her for months while she'd been completely unaware of the danger. And her exact words were, "How did you stay so calm? How did you see this coming and not fall apart?" And I told her the truth, because I prepared. And preparation turns panic into process. When you've already imagined the worst-case scenario and built a response to it, the worst case isn't scary anymore, it's just Tuesday. That's the gift of seeing clearly. You don't get to live in comfortable denial, but you get something better. You get to live in capable truth. So the sixth practice is this: trust your perceptions, even when no one else sees what you see. Document what you're noticing. Prepare for what you suspect. And accept that this might be lonely, because the alternative, ignoring your perceptions to maintain social comfort, is worse. That's how people get blindsided. That's how betrayals that could have been prevented become catastrophes. You're not responsible for making other people see what you see. You're only responsible for acting on what you know. Now let me talk about what happened after. Because the story doesn't end with that confrontation in the driveway. That was just the beginning of the harder part, rebuilding. Marcus agreed to therapy, not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was prison. And those first few sessions were brutal. He showed up in full defensive mode, ready to justify everything he'd done. The therapist, brilliant woman, specialized in family systems and betrayal, didn't argue with him. She just asked questions. What were you feeling the first time you looked up property fraud? What story were you telling yourself about William that made this feel justified? When did you start believing that taking something from him was the same as claiming something for yourself? And slowly, over weeks, the justifications crumbled, because when you have to speak your internal logic out loud to a neutral third party, you hear how it sounds. And what sounded reasonable in your head sounds delusional in the room. Marcus had to face that he'd created an entire fantasy where I was the villain keeping him down, when the reality was that his own insecurity was the prison, that no amount of property or money or external validation was going to fix the fundamental belief that he wasn't enough. And that's hard work. That's the work of actually looking at yourself instead of blaming your circumstances. Sarah had her own reckoning. She had to face that she'd known something was off. That there had been moments where Marcus said things that didn't quite add up, where his resentment toward me had been visible and she'd looked away. Not because she didn't love me, but because seeing it would have required action, and action was scary. She had to own that she'd been complicit through avoidance, that she'd enabled his narrative by never challenging it, that her silence had been interpreted as agreement, and I had to face my part too. Had to acknowledge that my competence had been a kind of violence, that by always being the one with answers, I'd made everyone around me feel like they didn't need to find their own, that my generosity had sometimes been a flex, a reminder of my capacity versus their lack. None of this excused what Marcus did, but it explained the ecosystem that made it possible. And here's what I learned from that process. Healing from betrayal isn't about forgiveness. It's about honesty. Everyone thinks the goal is to forgive and move on, but forgiveness without honesty is just rug sweeping. It's pretending the thing didn't happen so you don't have to feel uncomfortable. Real healing requires everyone to tell the truth. The betrayer has to tell the truth about what they did and why. The betrayed has to tell the truth about how it impacted them. And everyone involved has to tell the truth about the dynamics that made the betrayal possible. That's uncomfortable. It's messy. It requires sitting with shame and anger and grief and complexity. But it's the only way through. 6 months into therapy, Marcus said something that shifted everything. We were in a family session and the therapist asked him, if you could go back to that morning in the driveway, what would you do differently? And he said, I wouldn't have shown up at all, but not because I'd be afraid of getting caught, because I'd have been honest with William about how I was feeling months earlier. I'd have told him I felt small, that I needed to find my own success instead of living in his shadow, that I was grateful and resentful at the same time, and I didn't know how to hold both. And then he looked at me and said, I'm sorry I tried to take from you instead of just telling you I needed to build something of my own. That was the moment. Not forgiveness, but honesty. And honesty creates the possibility of something new. We're not all the way back. I don't know if we ever will be. Trust, once broken at that level, doesn't fully repair. It rebuilds into something different, something more cautious, more boundaried, but also more real. Marcus and Sarah are still together. He got a job in a different field, something where he's building his own reputation instead of being adjacent to mine. We see each other at family events. It's cordial. Sometimes it's even warm, but it's different. And different isn't bad. A different is just honest. The kids don't know the full story. They know there was a big problem that the grown-ups work through. That's enough for now. When they're older, if they ask, we'll tell them. But childhood should be protected from the full weight of adult dysfunction when possible. And me? I'm okay. Better than okay, actually, because I learned that I can face betrayal without becoming bitter, that I can protect myself without closing my heart, that I can be strong and kind at the same time. That's worth more than the house ever was. So let me bring this all together. Let me give you the framework you can actually use. When you're facing potential betrayal, whether it's from family, a partner, a business associate, anyone, here's the process. Step 1, trust your gut, but verify your facts. Your instinct is usually right. But you need evidence before you act. Document what you're noticing, date it, store it somewhere safe. This isn't paranoia. This is responsibility. Step 2, protect yourself quietly. Don't confront until you're safe. Update your legal structures, change your passwords, set up two-factor authentication, create systems that make betrayal either impossible or self-revealing. Do this without drama. Just quietly shore up your defenses. Step 3. Give them the chance to choose differently. Don't test them explicitly, but don't rescue them from consequences either. If someone is planning to betray you, let them walk far enough down that path that they reveal their intentions clearly. This isn't entrapment. This is allowing reality to teach. Step 4. When the betrayal happens, respond from security, not fear. You've already protected yourself, so now you can make a measured choice about consequences. Ask yourself, what does this person need to learn? What do I need to maintain my integrity? What serves the highest good of everyone involved? Step 5. Offer a path back, but make it require honesty. Consequences without possibility of redemption just create enemies, but redemption without consequences just enables. The path back should be hard, should require real change, but should exist. Step 6. Accept that things will be different. You're not trying to restore what was. You're trying to build something new that's grounded in truth instead of illusion. Different can be good if it's honest. That's the framework. And it works because it holds the paradox that most people can't hold. You can love someone and refuse to be destroyed by them. You can be open-hearted and strategically protected. You can hope for the best while preparing for the worst. These aren't contradictions. They're integration. They're what emotional maturity actually looks like. And here's what I want you to understand. If you're someone who's been betrayed and you're wondering if something's wrong with you because you're not more angry or more willing to cut people off completely, nothing is wrong with you. You're just sophisticated. You understand that people are complex, that they can hurt you and still be worthy of love, that protecting yourself doesn't require hating them. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. But also, if you've been betrayed and you are angry, if you do want to cut someone off completely, that's valid too. Some betrayals are unrecoverable. Some people don't do the work. Some relationships need to end for you to be safe. The key is choosing consciously instead of reacting automatically. Choose your boundaries from a place of clarity, not trauma. Choose your consequences from a place of wisdom, not wound. And if you're not sure which is which, ask yourself this. Am I making this choice because it's what's best for my long-term well-being, or because it's what my pain is demanding right now? Both might lead to the same action, but the internal stance is different. One creates freedom, the other creates a different kind of prison. I chose to offer Marcus a path back, not because my pain demanded it. My pain wanted him prosecuted. I chose it because my wisdom knew that destroying him would ultimately hurt people I loved, including a future version of myself who wants to be remembered as someone who was strong enough to be kind. That's the choice you get to make too. Not what your pain demands, but what your wisdom knows is right. And sometimes wisdom says, cut them off. Sometimes wisdom says second chances. Sometimes wisdom says something in between. There's no formula. There's only you in your specific situation with your specific values, making the choice you can live with. Just make it consciously. Make it from security, not fear. Make it from clarity, not confusion. Because that's the real victory, not over them. Over your own reactive patterns, over the temptation to let pain make your decisions, over the old stories about what strength looks like. The real victory is becoming someone who can face betrayal and remain yourself. Who can be hurt and not become hard? Who can protect themselves and still believe in people? That's the person I wanted to be that morning when I took that sip of coffee and smiled, not because I was happy about what was happening, but because I knew I'd prepared. I knew I was safe, and I knew that whatever happened next, I'd handle it from a place of groundedness instead of panic. And I did, and you can too. So here's what I want you to remember. Write this down if you need to. You're not broken for wanting to protect yourself. You're not cynical for preparing for betrayal. You're not unloving for setting boundaries. You're not weak for offering second chances. And you're not strong just because you cut people off. You're strong when you make conscious choices that align with your values, regardless of what anyone else thinks you should do. You're wise when you can see people clearly, both their goodness and their capacity for harm, and respond to the full truth instead of just the parts you wish were real. You're loving when you care enough about someone to let consequences teach them what your words could not. And you're free when you build a life so structurally sound that other people's chaos can't destabilize you. That's what that morning taught me. And that's what I hope this last hour has given you. Not a story about revenge, not a manual for catching betrayers, but a framework for living in integrity even when the people around you aren't, for staying soft even when the world demands hardness, for being wise without becoming cynical, because that's the real work, not protecting your property, protecting your humanity, making sure that when you face the worst in people, you don't become the worst version of yourself. I came through that experience still able to love, still able to trust, albeit more wisely, still able to sit across the table from Marcus at Thanksgiving and see both the person who tried to steal from me and the person who's trying to become better. That's not naivety, that's not doormat behavior. That's the kind of strength that only comes from being genuinely secure, and you can build that security. Starting today, starting with small things, update your estate documents, set up better accounting systems, document the important conversations, share your location with people who love you. Create two-factor authentication. Write down verbal agreements, not because you're preparing for war, because you're creating peace. The peace that comes from knowing that even if the worst happens, you've already handled it. And then, from that place of security, be as generous as you want. Love as openly as you want. Give people second chances, believe in their potential, hope for their growth, because that's what you can afford when you're actually safe. You can afford to be kind, you can afford to be optimistic, you can afford to see the best in people. Just make sure you can afford it first. That's the whole teaching. Build security, then build generosity in that order. Do it the other way around and you'll get destroyed. Do it in the right order and you'll become the kind of person who can face anything and remain themselves. And that's who I want to be. That's who I think you want to be too. Someone who's seen the worst and stayed soft. Someone who's been betrayed and stayed open. Someone who's won and stayed kind. That's the person worth becoming. Not the one who never gets hurt, but the one who gets hurt and heals into someone wiser instead of someone harder. So if you're facing a betrayal right now, or if you're worried one might be coming, or if you're just trying to figure out how to love people without being destroyed by them, I want you to know you're not alone in this. This is the human work. This is what we're all trying to figure out. And the fact that you're here, listening to this, thinking about these questions, that tells me you're someone who wants to do it right, who wants to be both strong and kind, who wants to protect yourself without losing yourself. That's rare. That's valuable. Don't let anyone tell you you're overthinking it or being too complicated. Complexity is appropriate when you're dealing with complex situations. Simple answers work for simple problems. This isn't simple, so give yourself permission to take your time, to prepare thoroughly, to build your security before you decide what mercy looks like, to hold the paradox that someone can be both loved and dangerous. You can do this, I know you can, because I did. And I'm not special. I'm just someone who decided that being betrayed wasn't going to determine who I became. And you can decide that too. All right, if this resonated with you, if something in this story or these frameworks shifted your perspective even a little bit, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment telling me which part landed hardest for you. Was it the idea that preparation is love, that systems are kinder than confrontations, that you have to decide who you want to be when you're winning. I read every comment, and honestly, your insights teach me things I didn't know I was saying. You all see angles I miss. So share your thoughts, tell me your story if you feel comfortable. This is a conversation, not a lecture. And if you want more of these conversations, the real ones, the complicated ones, the ones about power and family and money and trust, and all the messy human stuff we usually don't talk about, subscribe to this channel. I'm here every week trying to make sense of the same things you are, trying to figure out how to be a good person in a complicated world. And I'd love to have you along for that journey. If you know someone who's dealing with a betrayal right now, someone who's trying to figure out how to be strong without being cruel, or how to protect themselves without closing their heart, share this with them. Sometimes we all just need permission to do the hard thing in the kind way, and maybe this gives them that permission. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these questions. Thank you for doing the hard work of becoming wise instead of just becoming hard. I see you, I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.